Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about mo and mada, two expressions which can be a little confusing, particularly mo. If we look up mo in a Japanese to English dictionary, we get told that it means now, already, soon, before long, and sometimes even not anymore, as well as meaning another and being an expression of annoyance. How can it mean all these different time relations at the same time? Well, we're going to find out today, and we're going to see that it's not nearly as confusing as it looks. But first of all, I want to look at mada, which is a bit less confusing, but will give us the principles we need for understanding how mo really works. All right. So mada has a less confusing collection of definitions. Mostly we're told that it means either still or not yet. So let's start by looking at what it really does mean, what it really does. Mada does a number of things. It tells us about the present time. It situates the present time inside a time segment that stretches back into the past and is either expected to end, or at least the possibility of its ending is being considered. Most often it's expected to end. Now this does three things. It tells us about the present. So we can say that it is in fact a way of saying now, but now in a particular relation to the past and the future. What is that relation? Well, as you see, we have two things. We have a section of time in which now lies, and we have a transition point. Since it's a section of time, it can't go on forever, so there's a transition point at which it changes to another section of time with other qualities. That is expected in the future, or at least considered as a possibility in the future. Now, mada gives us two contrasts. The section of time is contrasted with the future when it will or may change, but the present moment is contrasted with the past when it might have been expected to change. So what this means in English is essentially still. And this may seem a bit abstract, but I think we'll understand it clearly enough when we see how it works. So if we say, shukudai wa mada shinakatta, we're saying, I haven't done my homework yet, or I still haven't done my homework. Now, as you see, this means that we're in a section of time where I haven't done my homework. This stretches back into the past and is contrasted with a period in the future where I will have done my homework. But the present time is being contrasted with a time in the past where I might have or should have done my homework. That's why we say mada. And that's why in English we would say still, or I haven't yet. In other words, there's a time in the past where it might have been expected to happen, but it hasn't. So it's still in a state which won't change until the future. And this is what we mean by terms like still and yet in English. If we say, Sakura wa mada wakai, we're saying Sakura is still young. Now again, what we're saying is that the present time is situated in a period where Sakura is young. That period stretches back into the past and is expected to change at some time in the future. She won't be young forever. She'll get older. So we can see that the time period while Sakura is young is contrasted with the future when she will get older. But the present moment is being contrasted with the past. That's why we say mada, or why in English we would say still. What we're saying is, she hasn't stopped being young yet, as opposed to the possibility that she stopped being young in the past. She hasn't stopped being young in the past, she's still young now, even though she won't be young in the future. If we say, Sakura wa mada otona de wa nai, we're saying Sakura is not yet grown up. So now we're using the negative, and that's why mada can mean still or not yet. It just depends, at least in this case, on the fact that it's being used with a negative. So if we say Sakura wa mada otona de wa nai, we're saying that at the present period, Sakura isn't grown up, even though you might have thought she'd grown up a little while ago. She hasn't, but of course she will grow up in the future. As you can see, the reason why it gets translated both as still and not yet is because Japanese puts things a little bit differently from English. In English we say Sakura is not yet grown up, but in Japanese what we actually say is Sakura is still not grown up. However, for mada to mean not yet, we don't have to have an explicit negative. For example, if someone says to you, Nihongo wa umai ne, your Japanese is very good, isn't it? Well, Japanese people tend to say that even if you can stagger out konnichiwa wa. And even if your Japanese really is very good, you'll probably reply, Ie, mada mada desu. Mada mada in this case means not yet. In other words, we're still in the time period where my Japanese isn't good. The change didn't take place in the past, as you were saying. It will have to take place in the future. And just a little cultural note. In the West, it can sometimes be considered a bit rude to contradict someone who said something nice to you. But in Japanese, we do that all the time. It's considered a bit arrogant not to. Now, let's move on to mo, where we get a few more apparent complications, but they aren't really complications, as we're going to see. Mo is essentially the opposite of mada. The best translation for it in English is that it means already. What it means is that we are now in a time segment stretching forward into the future. So, just the other way around from mada. The time segment is compared to the past, when the current conditions didn't prevail, and now is compared to the future, when the transition might have been expected to happen, but in fact, it's already happened. So if someone says, Shukudai o shinasai, do your homework, you might reply, Mou yatta yo, I already did it. So what we're saying is we are now in the time segment where my homework is done, I've done it, and the transition isn't going to happen in the future as you might think. It's already happened in the past. So why is it sometimes translated as having different meanings from already, such as now? Well, as we've seen, both mada, still, and mo, already, are in fact species of now. We're talking about now, we're just making different contrasts with the past and the future when we talk about now. So, of course, mo does mean now, just as already does. But because words in different languages very rarely occupy exactly the same stretch of the meaning spectrum, sometimes we use mo in places where we would use now in English, and because JE dictionaries are Anglo-centric, they will try to translate mo as meaning now in those cases. So, for example, if you've hurt yourself and you're getting up and somebody says, Daijoubu, and you reply, Mo daijoubu. How you would translate this into English is usually, I'm alright now. In English, you wouldn't usually say, I'm already alright. Now in Japanese, you could also say, Ima daijoubu, which also means I'm alright now. But when you say mo daijoubu, you're specifically adding the nuance that while you weren't alright before, you are now, as opposed to at some time in the near future, alright. In other words, you don't need any more time to recover, you're okay. In English, we don't use already for that. Logically, we could, but in practice we usually don't. Now, it's perfectly true to say that more is also used as an expression of annoyance or exasperation. More! And it can preface all kinds of complaints or grumbles, or it can just be on its own. More! How does that work? Interestingly, already can in some circumstances have a little bit of that kind of nuance in English. So if someone says enough already, what they mean is, at this point, as opposed to at some point in the future, I'm fed up with it. And that's really what more tends to mean in Japanese. So that's really simple enough. However, there is one aspect of more which is a tiny bit confusing until you understand it. And that is that there are really two words, more. Now, this may be a little bit controversial, but in fact, in pinch accent dictionaries, they're actually given two different accentuations. One for the more that we've been talking about, the one that means already, and one for another more, which is quite close in many respects, and I'll explain why it's quite close later. But first of all, let's look at the area where it isn't so close. The second more, I think, is ultimately related to the particle more, and it has the same additive kind of meaning of another. So if we say more hitotsu, we're saying another one. If we're saying more hitori, we're saying another person. So when we put it like that, we can see we're really dealing with two separate words, two separate concepts. Now, it then becomes a little bit more confusing, and I'm going to tell you why. It even confuses Japanese people who actually don't do this pitch accent thing right in many cases, because the idea that they are two different words often gets rather lost, even by Japanese natives. And the reason for that is that there are many cases where they get pretty close. Why? Well, as we've seen, more tells us about a time relation. It's a time-related word, and it means already. And also the dictionaries tell us that it means soon. Why do they say that it means soon? Well, it doesn't mean soon on its own, but it means soon in certain combinations. So, for example, if we say mo sugu, which means soon, what we're really saying is sugu means soon and mo means already. So that mo is emphasizing the soon. It's already soon. It's not going to be soon at some point in the future. It's soon right now. Now we can also say mo skoshi. For example, if people are walking somewhere and they've been walking for a long time and they're getting tired, someone might say mo skoshi, which means just a little more, just a little extra. And it could mean just a little more effort, but it can also mean just a little more time. So you see, mo sugu and mo skoshi, even though they're different words, more, under some circumstances, have a very similar meaning. And the other more, the additive more, also is often used to express time relations. So if we say mo ichido, we're saying one more time. Now obviously this means very much the same as it means when we say mo hitotsu, which means one more thing, one more candy, one more anything. But it also is very often used with ichido, one more time. Mo nido konai means I'll never come again. Literally, I won't come for another second time. So we can see that the two mores tread fairly closely toward the same territory. They can both be used for time relations, and in a few contexts, like mo skoshi and mo sugu, the meaning is almost identical. But once we understand the two and how they work, I don't think there's going to be any more room for confusion. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons who really do make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. All of you make all of this possible. And I'm truly thankful to you all. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.